Episode 109. Harry looked around. This ward bore unmistakable signs of being a permanent home to its residents. They had many more personal effects around their beds than in Mr. Weasley's ward. The wall around Gilderoy's headboard, for instance, was papered with pictures of himself, all beaming toothily and waving at the new arrivals. He had autographed many of them to himself in disjointed, childish writing. The moment he had been deposited in his chair by the healer, Gilderoy pulled a fresh stack of photographs toward him, seized a quill, and started signing them all feverishly.
"You can put them in envelopes,"
he said to Ginny, throwing the signed pictures into her lap one by one as he finished them.
"I am not forgotten, you know. No, I still receive a very great deal of fan mail. Gladys Gudgeon writes weekly. I just wish I knew why."
He paused, looking faintly puzzled, then beamed again and returned to his signing with renewed vigor.
"I suspect it is simply my good looks."
A sallow-skinned, mournful-looking wizard lay in the bed opposite, staring at the ceiling. He was mumbling to himself and seemed quite unaware of anything around him. 2 beds along was a woman whose entire head was covered in fur. Harry remembered something similar happening to Hermione during their second year, although fortunately the damage in her case had not been permanent. At the far end of the ward, flowery curtains had been drawn around 2 beds to give the occupants and their visitors some privacy.
"Here you are, Agnes,"
said the healer brightly to the furry-faced woman, handing her a small pile of Christmas presents.
"Say, not forgotten, are ya? And your son sent an owl to say he's visiting tonight, so that's nice, isn't it?"
Agnes gave several loud barks.
"And look, Broderick, you've been sent a potted plant and a lovely calendar with a different fancy hippogriff for each month. They'll brighten things up, won't they?"
said the healer, bustling along to the mumbling man, setting a rather ugly plant with long, swaying tentacles on the bedside cabinet, and fixing the calendar to the wall with her wand.
"And, oh, Mrs. Longbottom, are you leaving already?"
Harry's head spun around. The curtains had been drawn back from the 2 beds at the end of the ward, and 2 visitors were walking back down the aisle between the beds. A formidable-looking old witch wearing a long green dress, a moth-eaten fox fur, and a pointed hat decorated with what was unmistakably a stuffed vulture, and trailing behind her, looking thoroughly depressed, Neville. With a sudden rush of understanding, Harry realized who the people in the end beds must be. He cast around wildly for some means of distracting the others so that Neville could leave the ward unnoticed and unquestioned. But Ron had looked up at the sound of the name Longbottom too, and before Harry could stop him, he had called, "Neville!" Neville jumped and cowered as though a bullet had narrowly missed him.
"It's us, Neville," said Ron brightly, getting to his feet. "Have you seen? Lockhart's here. Have you been visiting?"
"Friends of yours, Neville dear," said Neville's grandmother graciously, bearing down upon them all. Neville looked as though he would rather be anywhere in the world but here. A dull purple flush was creeping up his plump face, and he was not making eye contact with any of them. "Ah, yes," said his grandmother, looking closely at Harry and sticking out a shriveled, claw-like hand for him to shake.
Yes, I know who you are, of course. Neville speaks most highly of you."
Thanks," said Harry, shaking hands. Neville did not look at him, but stared at his own feet, the color deepening in his face all the while. "And you 2 are clearly Weasleys," Mrs. Longbottom continued, proffering her hand regally to Ron and Ginny in turn. "Yes, I know your parents. Not well, of course, but fine people, fine people. And you must be Hermione Granger." Hermione looked rather startled that Mrs. Longbottom knew her name, but shook hands all the same.
"Yes, Neville's told me about you. Helped him out of a few sticky spots, haven't you? He's a good boy, she said, casting a sternly appraising look down her rather bony nose at Neville. But he hasn't got his father's talent, I'm afraid to say. And she jerked her head in the direction of the two beds at the end of the ward, so that the stuffed vulture on her hat trembled alarmingly. "What?" said Ron, looking amazed. Harry wanted to stamp on Ron's foot, but that sort of thing was much harder to bring off unnoticed when you were wearing jeans rather than robes. "Is that your dad round the end, Neville?" "What's this?" said Mrs. Longbottom sharply. "Haven't you told your friends about your parents, Neville?" Neville took a deep breath, looked up at the ceiling, and shook his head. Harry could not remember ever feeling sorrier for anyone, but he could not think of any way of helping Neville out of the situation. "Well, it's nothing to be ashamed of," said Mrs. Longbottom angrily. "You should be proud, Neville. Proud. They didn't give their health and their sanity so their only son would be ashamed of them, you know." "I'm not ashamed," said Neville very faintly, still looking anywhere but at Harry and the others. Ron was now standing on tiptoe to look over at the inhabitants of the two beds. "Well, you've got a funny way of showing it," said Mrs. Longbottom. "My son and his wife," she said, turning haughtily to Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny, "were tortured into insanity by you-know-who's followers." Hermione and Ginny both clapped their hands over their mouths. Ron stopped craning his neck to catch a glimpse of Neville's parents and looked mortified. "They were horrors, you know, and very well respected within the wizarding community," Mrs. Longbottom went on. "Highly gifted, the pair of them. Yes, Alice, dear, what is it?" Neville's mother had come edging down the ward in her nightdress. She no longer had the plump, happy-looking face Harry had seen in Moody's old photograph of the original Order of the Phoenix. Her face was thin and worn now. Her eyes seemed overlarge, and her hair, which had turned white, was wispy and dead-looking. She did not seem to want to speak, or perhaps she was not able to, but she made timid motions toward Neville, holding something in her outstretched hand. "Again," said Mrs. Longbottom, sounding slightly weary. "Very well, Alice, dear, very well. Neville, take it, whatever it is." But Neville had already stretched out his hand, into which his mother dropped an empty Jewel's blowing gum wrapper. "Very nice, dear," said Neville's grandmother in a falsely cheery voice, patting his mother on the shoulder. But Neville said quietly, "Thanks, Mum." His mother tottered away, back up the ward, humming to herself. Neville looked around at the others, his expression defiant, as though daring them to laugh. But Harry did not think he'd ever found anything less funny in his life. "Well, we'd better get back," sighed Mrs. Longbottom, drawing on her long green gloves. "Very nice to have met you all. Neville, put that wrapper in the bin. She must have given you enough of them to paper your bedroom by now." But as they left, Harry was sure he saw Neville slip the wrapper into his pocket. The door closed behind them. "I never knew," said Hermione, who looked tearful. "Nor did I," said Ron rather hoarsely. "Not me," whispered Ginny. They all looked at Harry. "I did," he said glumly. "Dumbledore told me, but I promised I wouldn't mention it. That's what Bellatrix Lestrange got sent to Azkaban for, using the Cruciatus curse on Neville's parents until they lost their minds." "Bellatrix Lestrange did that?" whispered Hermione, horrified. "The woman Creature's got a photo of in his den?" There was a long silence, broken by Lockhart's angry voice.
"Look, I didn't learn joined-up writing for nothing, you know."
Chapter 24. Clemency. Creature, it transpired, had been lurking in the attic. Sirius said he had found him up there, covered in dust, no doubt looking for more relics of the Black family to hide in his cupboard.